We don't need some diversity consultant telling us how to run our business. The Hamilton family's racist laughter echoed through their marble conference room as Eleanor Washington walked out. 6 weeks later, their company stock crashed, creditors were demanding payment, and that same woman they destroyed was holding a document that could save or bury them forever. Her next move would shock Chicago's elite and prove that revenge is a dish best served with perfect timing. Before we start, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like the video and comment where you are watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's go back to 3 weeks earlier. Eleanor Washington adjusted her burgundy blazer one final time before stepping out of her Honda Civic onto the tree-lined streets of Lincoln Park. The October morning carried that sharp Chicago bite that made her think of fresh starts and new challenges. At 34, she had built her reputation as one of the city's most sought-after financial consultants, specializing in corporate restructuring. Her modest apartment on North Cleveland Avenue might not scream success to some, but every carefully chosen piece of furniture represented a victory earned through merit, not inheritance. The morning light filtered through her apartment's large windows as she reviewed the Hamilton Textiles file one more time. The company had been a Chicago institution since 1924, surviving the Great Depression, 2 World Wars, and countless economic downturns. Now, according to the preliminary financial statements they'd provided, they were facing their greatest challenge yet. Eleanor's initial analysis suggested the situation was far worse than they realized, but she'd seen companies pull back from similar brink. The key was convincing leadership to make hard decisions quickly. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. Hamilton meeting confirmed for 10 a.m. Address: 300 North LaSalle Street, 47th floor. Eleanor smiled, remembering her mother's words from years ago. Baby girl, you carry our whole family's dreams with you. Show them what we're made of. Across town in the Gold Coast, Robert Hamilton stood in his mansion's dining room, staring out at Lake Michigan while his wife Catherine arranged white roses in a crystal vase. At 68, Robert still possessed the commanding presence that had helped him expand the family textile business into a multi-million-dollar empire. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his navy suit impeccably tailored. But this morning, worry lines creased his face as he sipped his coffee from bone china. The bank called again, Catherine said without looking up from her flowers. At 65, she maintained the elegant beauty that had made her a sought-after debutante 40 years ago. Her platinum hair was swept into a classic chignon, and her cream-colored dress spoke of quiet wealth. They want answers about the quarterly projections. Let them wait, Robert replied, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Hamilton Textiles has weathered storms before. A few bad quarters don't sink a legacy. Their daughter Patricia entered the dining room, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floors. At 38, she had inherited her mother's refined features and her father's business instincts, though she'd chosen to focus on social causes rather than corporate management. Her emerald dress complemented her auburn hair, which she wore in a sophisticated bob. "Father, I just got off the phone with Thomas," she said, settling into her chair with practiced grace. "He's concerned about the numbers the accountants showed him yesterday. Maybe we should consider bringing in outside help." Robert's jaw tightened. "Outside help? Patricia, this company has been in our family for nearly a century. We don't need some stranger telling us how to run our business." Thomas Hamilton chose that moment to arrive, still wearing his running gear from his morning jog along the lakefront. At 35, he possessed his father's height and commanding presence, though his brown hair was tousled and his cheeks flushed from exercise. Unlike his sister, Thomas had thrown himself into learning every aspect of Hamilton Textiles, preparing to eventually take over the family legacy. "Sorry I'm late," he said, grabbing a piece of toast. "I wanted to review those consultant applications one more time before this morning's meeting." Catherine looked up sharply. "Consultant? I thought we agreed." "The board insisted," Thomas interrupted, settling into his chair. "Apparently, our quarterly losses have some investors nervous. They want an independent assessment." Robert's face darkened. "And who exactly are we entertaining with our private business matters?" Thomas consulted his phone. "Eleanor Washington from Washington Financial Consulting. She comes highly recommended. Restructured 3 major companies last year, impressive track record with crisis management. Washington. Patricia raised an eyebrow. That sounds what? Thomas asked, though his tone suggested he knew exactly what his sister was thinking. Catherine set down her coffee cup with a delicate clink. Well, we just want to make sure whoever we hire understands our culture. Hamilton Textiles has always maintained certain standards. Eleanor finished her subway ride from Lincoln Park to downtown, her mind focused on the presentation she'd prepared. The Hamilton account could be career-defining if handled correctly. Companies with their kind of legacy and market position didn't go down easily, but they also didn't adapt quickly to changing business landscape. Her job would be finding the balance between preserving their strengths and modernizing their approach. As she walked through the Loop's busy streets, Eleanor's thoughts drifted to her mother, Sandra, who had worked as a seamstress for over 30 years. Sandra had often told stories about the families she'd worked for, their beautiful homes, their casual wealth, their sometimes casual cruelty. "Remember, Eleanor," she'd say while hemming another dress, "our worth isn't determined by what they think of us. But sometimes, we have to show them what they're missing." Eleanor checked her reflection in a shop window. Her burgundy blazer was sharp and professional, paired with a black pencil skirt and low heels that allowed her to walk confidently through the city. Her dark hair was styled in a sleek professional cut that framed her face beautifully. She'd learned long ago that first impressions mattered, especially in corporate consulting where credibility was everything. The Hamilton Textiles building rose 47 stories into the Chicago sky, its glass and steel facade reflecting the morning sun. Eleanor rode the elevator up, reviewing her talking points one final time. The preliminary numbers suggested a company in serious trouble, declining revenues, increased competition from overseas manufacturers, and a business model that hadn't evolved with changing consumer preferences. But the Hamilton name still carried weight in Chicago business circles. With the right strategy, they could reinvent themselves. Meanwhile, the Hamilton family finished their breakfast with the comfortable efficiency of people who had shared thousands of similar mornings. Robert straightened his tie and checked his watch, a vintage Rolex that had belonged to his father. "I suppose we should get this over with," he said, his tone suggesting he viewed the upcoming meeting as an unfortunate necessity rather than a potential solution. Catherine kissed his cheek gently. "Just remember, darling, we've built something beautiful together. Don't let some outsider make you doubt that." Thomas grabbed his suit jacket from the back of his chair. "I'll drive, father. Patricia, are you coming?" "Wouldn't miss it," she replied, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm curious to see what this Washington person thinks she can tell us about our own business." As the family prepared to leave their Gold Coast mansion, Eleanor was already in the Hamilton Textiles lobby, admiring the marble floors and brass fixtures that spoke of old Chicago money. The receptionist, a young woman with a bright smile, directed her to the executive floor. "They're expecting you," she said warmly. "Elevator bank C will take you straight up to 47. Eleanor smiled back, her confidence steady. She'd handled difficult clients before, and the Hamiltons' reputation for traditional values wouldn't intimidate her. After all, she had something they needed, the expertise to save their company. "What do you think Eleanor will discover about the Hamilton family's true financial situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe for amazing stories that showcase the triumph of the human spirit." The elevator doors opened onto the 47th floor, revealing an executive suite that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1980s. Dark wood paneling, leather furniture, and oil paintings of stern-faced men who looked remarkably similar to Robert Hamilton. Eleanor approached the reception desk, where another young woman greeted her professionally. "Ms. Washington? The Hamilton family is waiting for you in the conference room. Right through those doors." Eleanor took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked toward what she believed would be a straightforward business consultation. She had no way of knowing that the next hour would challenge everything she thought she knew about professional respect, human dignity, and her own strength. The conference room doors were heavy oak, and as Eleanor pushed them open, she saw 4 people seated around a polished mahogany table that could easily accommodate 20. The room's windows offered a spectacular view of Lake Michigan, and the walls displayed framed photographs of the company's history, ribbon cuttings, groundbreaking ceremonies, and handshake deals that had built the Hamilton empire. But Eleanor's attention was immediately drawn to the family members who would determine not just her professional future, but challenge her faith in human decency in ways she never could have imagined. Eleanor entered the conference room with the quiet confidence that had carried her through countless corporate meetings. Her burgundy blazer caught the morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and her leather portfolio contained what she believed would be their salvation. She'd spent 3 sleepless nights analyzing their numbers, crafting a restructuring plan that could pull Hamilton Textiles back from the financial precipice. "Good morning," she said, extending her hand toward the distinguished man at the head of the table. "Mr. Hamilton, I'm Eleanor Washington. Thank you for considering Washington Financial Consulting for this project." Robert Hamilton remained seated, his steel-gray eyes giving her a once-over that felt more like an inspection than a greeting. After a moment that stretched uncomfortably long, he gestured vaguely toward an empty chair. "Please sit." Eleanor noticed he hadn't shaken her hand, but she maintained her professional composure. Catherine Hamilton, elegant in her cream-colored dress, offered a tight smile that never reached her eyes. Patricia sat perfectly poised, her emerald dress immaculate, while Thomas leaned back in his chair with the casual confidence of inherited privilege. "So," Robert began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling every conversation, "the board seems to think we need outside perspective on our recent challenges." Eleanor opened her portfolio, revealing charts, graphs, and financial projections she'd prepared with meticulous care. "Based on the preliminary information your team provided, I've identified several areas where Hamilton Textiles can restructure to improve profitability and long-term sustainability." She spread the documents across the mahogany table, her voice steady and professional. "Your company has tremendous assets, brand recognition, established distribution networks, and a legacy of quality that competitors can't replicate. However, the numbers indicate some serious concerns that need immediate attention." Thomas leaned forward slightly, and for a moment Eleanor thought she detected genuine interest. "What kind of concerns?" Eleanor pulled out a detailed financial analysis, her dark eyes serious as she met each family member's gaze. "Your overhead costs have increased 43% over the past 2 years, while revenues have declined by 37%. Your manufacturing costs are significantly higher than industry standards, and your customer retention rate has dropped to 62%. She pointed to a graph showing the company's declining trajectory. "Without immediate intervention, Hamilton Textiles will be facing bankruptcy within 8 months. Possibly sooner if the holiday season doesn't meet projections." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor watched their faces, expecting to see the concern or urgency that usually accompanied such revelations. Instead, she saw something that made her stomach drop. Robert Hamilton began to chuckle. It started as a low rumble in his chest, then grew into full laughter. Catherine joined him, her refined giggle somehow more cutting than outright mockery. Patricia covered her mouth with her manicured hand, trying to contain her amusement, while Thomas shook his head with a grin that suggested he found the entire situation absurd. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said, confusion creeping into her voice. "Did I say something amusing?" Robert wiped his eyes, still chuckling. "Oh, my dear, you certainly did. Bankruptcy? Hamilton Textiles." He gestured around the opulent conference room. "Do we look like a company facing bankruptcy?" Catherine leaned forward, her voice dripping with condescension. "Sweetheart, I think there might be some confusion. We asked for a consultation, not a comedy show." Eleanor felt heat rising in her cheeks, but she maintained her professional demeanor. "Mr. Hamilton, these numbers come directly from your accounting department. I've triple-checked every calculation. Your company is in serious financial trouble." "Numbers," Patricia said dismissively, waving her hand as if brushing away an annoying fly. "Anyone can manipulate numbers to tell whatever story they want. The question is, what makes you think you understand our business better than we do?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Eleanor realized this wasn't about the numbers at all. She'd encountered skepticism before, but this felt different. More personal. More targeted. "I have a master's degree in finance from Northwestern and 15 years of experience in corporate restructuring," Eleanor replied, her voice remaining steady despite the growing knot in her stomach. I've successfully guided 17 companies through similar crises, including 3 textile manufacturers. Thomas sat back in his chair, his brown eyes sparkling with what looked like genuine amusement. Northwestern, you say? Interesting. And tell me, how exactly did you acquire this expertise? The emphasis on acquire made Eleanor's skin crawl. She'd heard that tone before, the subtle implication that her achievements were somehow illegitimate, unearned, or the result of special considerations rather than merit. Through hard work, dedication, and proven results, she replied firmly. My track record speaks for itself. Robert's laughter returned, louder this time. Oh, I'm sure it does. But you have to understand, Ms. Washington, Hamilton Textiles isn't some struggling corner store that needs, what do they call it? Diversity consulting. Eleanor's professional mask began to slip. This isn't diversity consulting, Mr. Hamilton. This is financial restructuring. Your company is bleeding money, and without immediate action. Our company, Catherine interrupted, her voice sharp now, has been thriving for nearly a century. We didn't build this empire by listening to every person who walks through our doors claiming to have answers. The pause before person was deliberate, loaded with meaning that made Eleanor's heart race with a mixture of anger and humiliation. She looked around the table, searching for even a hint of professional respect, but found only varying degrees of amusement and dismissal. Patricia leaned forward, her voice taking on a mock-sympathetic tone. Honey, I'm sure you mean well, but perhaps you'd be more comfortable working with companies that are more suited to your particular background? Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she gathered her documents. 15 years of fighting for respect in boardrooms dominated by people who looked nothing like her, 15 years of proving herself over and over again, and still she faced the same casual racism disguised as professional skepticism. My particular background, she said slowly, her voice now carrying an edge that hadn't been there before, includes saving Peterson Manufacturing from a hostile takeover, restructuring Collins Automotive to profitability, and turning around 3 companies that were in worse shape than Hamilton Textiles currently is. Thomas shook his head, grinning widely. Look, I'm sure you're very capable at what you do. But Hamilton Textiles operates at a different level. We have standards, traditions, ways of doing business that have worked for generations. Ways that are currently driving you toward bankruptcy, Eleanor replied, her professional composure finally cracking. Your traditions are killing your company. The laughter stopped abruptly. Robert's face darkened and Catherine's refined features hardened into something cold and ugly. Patricia sat straighter, her emerald dress suddenly looking like armor, while Thomas's casual grin turned predatory. I think, Robert said slowly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that had silenced boardrooms for decades, that this meeting is over. Eleanor stared at him, disbelief warring with rage in her chest. You're not even going to look at the analysis? Your company is dying, and you're more concerned with who's delivering the diagnosis than with finding a cure. Catherine's laugh was like breaking glass. Oh, darling, our company isn't dying. And even if it were, we certainly wouldn't entrust its care to someone who clearly doesn't understand our culture. The word culture landed like a slap. Eleanor had heard it before, code for people like you don't belong here. She gathered her portfolio with hands that shook with fury, her documents scattered across the mahogany table like evidence of their willful ignorance. You know what? Eleanor said, standing to her full height and looking each family member in the eye. When your company fails, and it will fail, remember this moment. Remember that someone tried to save you, and you were too blinded by your own prejudice to listen. Thomas actually applauded slowly, his clapping echoing through the conference room. Bravo! Very dramatic. Did they teach you that at Northwestern, or is that just natural talent? Eleanor felt something break inside her chest, a small, vulnerable part of herself that still believed in fairness and meritocracy. She'd faced racism before, but never so blatantly, never with such casual cruelty. These people weren't just dismissing her expertise, they were dismissing her humanity. I've worked with arrogant executives before, she said, her voice barely controlled. But I've never encountered people so willfully determined to destroy themselves rather than accept help from someone they consider beneath them. Patricia gasped theatrically. Beneath us? Oh my goodness, where on earth did you get that idea? The mock innocence was the final straw. Eleanor snapped her portfolio shut and headed toward the door, her burgundy blazer a splash of dignity in a room full of casual hatred. "Good luck," she said without turning around. "You're going to need it." As she reached for the door handle, Robert's voice followed her. "Ms. Washington? When you're looking for your next client, might I suggest focusing on companies that are more appropriate for your particular skill set?" Eleanor paused, her hand on the door handle, every instinct screaming at her to turn around and unleash the fury building in her chest. Instead, she opened the door and walked out, leaving behind the sound of renewed laughter that would haunt her for weeks to come. The elevator ride down 47 floors felt like falling through quicksand. Eleanor's reflection in the polished steel doors showed a professional woman in a burgundy blazer, but inside she felt like the little girl her mother had warned about this world. The world where your worth could be dismissed with laughter, where your expertise meant nothing if it came wrapped in the wrong skin color. By the time she reached the marble lobby, tears were threatening to spill over. The same receptionist who had greeted her warmly an hour earlier now looked at her with confusion and concern. "Ms. Washington? How did the meeting go?" Eleanor managed a professional smile that felt like it might crack her face. "It was enlightening." She walked out of the Hamilton Textiles building into the crisp October air, her mind reeling with humiliation and rage. Behind her, 47 floors up, the Hamilton family was still laughing about the presumptuous black woman who thought she could save their empire. They had no idea that in exactly 3 weeks, their laughter would turn to desperate silence as their company's stock price plummeted and creditors began circling like vultures. They had no idea that the woman they dismissed would become their only hope for survival. But that reckoning was still to come. For now, Eleanor Washington walked through downtown Chicago with her dignity intact and her portfolio full of solutions that no one wanted to hear, unaware that she had just witnessed the beginning of the Hamilton family's downfall and her own unexpected journey towards something that looked remarkably like justice. Eleanor's Honda Civic sat in the parking garage beneath her Lincoln Park apartment building like a sanctuary. She gripped the steering wheel with both hands, her knuckles white against the black leather, and finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. The burgundy blazer that had made her feel so confident that morning now felt like a costume, a disguise that hadn't fooled anyone. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. "How did the Hamilton meeting go? Should I start preparing the contract?" Eleanor stared at the screen, unsure how to respond. How do you explain that a family had laughed at your expertise, dismissed your analysis, and made it clear that your presence was unwelcome? How do you put into words the casual cruelty of people who saw your skin color before they saw your credentials? She typed back, "Meeting didn't go as expected. We'll call you later." The drive home through Chicago's afternoon traffic felt surreal. The city continued its relentless pace around her. Pedestrians hurrying across intersections, construction crews working on the Kennedy Expressway, office workers grabbing coffee from street vendors. But Eleanor felt disconnected from it all, as if she were watching life through a window rather than living it. By the time she reached her apartment on North Cleveland Avenue, the October sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. Eleanor climbed the 3 flights of stairs to her door, each step feeling heavier than the last. Her apartment, usually a refuge of carefully chosen furniture and warm colors, felt different now. The burgundy throw pillows on her cream-colored sofa seemed to mock her morning's confidence, and the framed degrees on her wall, Northwestern University, various professional certifications, felt like hollow trophies. She set her portfolio on the kitchen counter and stared at it as if it contained evidence of some crime. Inside were hours of meticulous analysis, charts showing exactly how Hamilton Textiles could save itself, projections that could have preserved hundreds of jobs. All of it dismissed with laughter. Eleanor's phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. Her mother's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment she considered letting it go to voicemail. Sandra Washington had an uncanny ability to sense when her daughter was struggling, even from her small apartment in Bronzeville. "Hey, Mama," Eleanor answered, trying to inject normalcy into her voice. "Baby girl, what's wrong?" Sandra's voice carried the kind of maternal radar that had guided Eleanor through childhood's scraped knees and teenage heartbreak. "You sound like somebody stole your lunch money." Despite everything, Eleanor smiled. Her mother's South Side directness had always cut through pretense and gotten straight to the heart of matters. Just had a difficult client meeting today. Difficult how? Somebody questioning your work again? The again hung in the air between them, acknowledging the reality they both knew, that Eleanor's expertise would always be questioned in ways that her white colleagues never experienced. Sandra had worked as a seamstress for over 30 years, her talented hands creating beautiful clothes for families who rarely bothered to learn her name. She understood the weight of being dismissed by people who assumed their wealth made them superior. Something like that, Eleanor replied, sinking onto her sofa. Mama, do you ever wonder if it's worth it? Fighting for respect that should be automatic. Sandra was quiet for a moment, and Eleanor could picture her in her small kitchen, probably preparing dinner while considering her response. When she spoke, her voice carried the wisdom of someone who had faced similar battles for decades. Eleanor, let me tell you something I learned from working for rich folks all these years. Their money don't make them smart, and their skin color don't make them right. But baby, the work you do, saving companies, protecting jobs, that's bigger than their ignorance. Eleanor felt tears threatening again. But what if they won't let me do the work? What if their prejudice matters more than people's livelihoods? Then, Sandra said firmly, you keep your head up and remember that their loss is somebody else's gain. God has a way of humbling the proud, baby girl. You just wait and see. Meanwhile, across town in the Gold Coast, the Hamilton family was having their own post-meeting discussion over cocktails in their mansion's library. The room's dark wood paneling and leather-bound books created an atmosphere of old money and older traditions. Oil paintings of previous Hamilton generations looked down from the walls like stern judges. Robert stood by the marble fireplace, a crystal tumbler of whiskey in his hand, still chuckling about the morning's events. His silver hair caught the light from the chandelier above, and his navy suit remained impeccable despite the day's activities. I have to admit, he said to his family, that was more entertaining than I expected. The audacity of that woman, walking into our boardroom and telling us our business was failing. Catherine reclined in a burgundy velvet armchair, her cream-colored dress arranged perfectly around her legs. She sipped her martini delicately, her platinum hair still flawlessly styled. The presumption was remarkable. As if we'd trust the future of Hamilton Textiles to someone who clearly doesn't understand our standards. Thomas loosened his tie and settled into his favorite leather chair, a gin and tonic in his hand. His brown hair was slightly mussed now, giving him a more relaxed appearance than his morning's corporate precision. Did you see her face when we started laughing? She actually thought we were going to take her seriously. Patricia entered the library carrying her own cocktail, a French 75 that sparkled in the crystal glass. Her emerald dress swished softly as she moved, and her auburn hair remained perfectly styled in its sophisticated bob. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But really, someone should have explained our culture before wasting everyone's time. The word culture carried the same loaded meaning it had in the conference room, and all four family members understood its implications perfectly. Hamilton Textiles had operated for nearly a century with certain unspoken rules about who belonged and who didn't, and they saw no reason to change now. The bank called again this afternoon, Thomas mentioned casually, swirling his drink. Something about wanting to schedule another meeting about our quarterly projections. Robert waved dismissively. Banks are always nervous. It's their nature. A few bad quarters don't erase 99 years of success. Catherine nodded in agreement. Your father's right, dear. We've weathered economic storms before. The Hamilton name means something in this city, has for generations. But even as they spoke, none of them mentioned the phone calls that had been coming with increasing frequency. Creditors asking about payment schedules, suppliers requesting meetings about extended payment terms, board members expressing concerns about the company's direction. The financial storm clouds gathering around Hamilton Textiles were becoming harder to ignore, but the family had perfected the art of denial over decades of inherited privilege. Patricia's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and frowned slightly. That was Jennifer from the country club. She mentioned hearing some rumors about Hamilton Textiles at the charity luncheon today. What kind of rumors? Robert's voice carried a slight edge now. Nothing specific. Just concerns about the company's stability. She wondered if we were considering any major changes. The room fell silent for a moment. In their insular world of Gold Coast society, Rumors could be as damaging as actual financial difficulties. Their social standing was intricately tied to their business success, and any perception of weakness could ripple through Chicago's elite circles like wildfire. Thomas cleared his throat. Maybe we should consider bringing in someone for a second opinion. Not that Washington woman, obviously, but someone more appropriate. Robert's jaw tightened. Absolutely not. The moment we bring in outside consultants, we signal weakness to our competitors and our investors. Hamilton Textiles is strong, and we'll prove it by continuing to operate as we always have. Catherine reached over and patted her husband's arm supportively. Of course, darling. We've built something beautiful together, something that can't be destroyed by temporary setbacks or the opinions of people who don't understand our world. Back in Lincoln Park, Eleanor sat on her sofa with a cup of tea, trying to process the day's events. The afternoon had faded into evening, and the lights of downtown Chicago twinkled through her windows like distant stars. She'd changed out of her burgundy blazer and into comfortable jeans and a soft sweater, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being diminished, reduced to a stereotype in a conference room full of people who had never had to prove their worth. Her laptop sat open on the coffee table, displaying the Hamilton Textiles analysis she'd worked so hard to perfect. The numbers didn't lie. The company was hemorrhaging money, losing market share, and operating with a business model that belonged in the 1990s. Their manufacturing costs were astronomical compared to competitors who had modernized their operations. Their customer base was aging, and they'd failed to attract younger consumers who valued both quality and social responsibility. Eleanor knew she could save them. She'd faced similar challenges before and found creative solutions that preserved jobs while positioning companies for future growth. But the Hamilton family had made it clear that her expertise was unwelcome, her analysis unwanted, her very presence an insult to their sensibilities. Her phone rang again. This time it was her best friend Angela, a fellow Northwestern graduate who worked as a marketing executive downtown. "How did the big meeting go?" Angela asked without preamble. "Are you about to become Chicago's newest corporate hero?" Eleanor laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Let's just say it didn't go as planned." "What happened? Did they not like your presentation?" "They didn't get past the presenter," Eleanor replied bitterly. "Turns out the Hamilton family isn't interested in working with consultants who don't fit their culture." Angela was quiet for a moment, understanding immediately what that meant. As a black woman in corporate America, she'd faced similar challenges. "I'm sorry, El. That's their loss, and eventually they'll realize it." "Will they, though? People like that have been insulated from consequences their entire lives. Why would that change now?" "Because," Angela said firmly, "reality has a way of breaking through even the thickest bubbles of privilege. You can't laugh away financial facts forever." Eleanor wanted to believe that, but sitting in her apartment with the memory of their laughter still ringing in her ears, justice felt like a distant concept. The Hamilton family was probably enjoying cocktails in their mansion right now, secure in their belief that their world would continue unchanged, that their prejudices had protected them from having to face uncomfortable truths. Neither Eleanor nor the Hamiltons could have predicted that in exactly 2 weeks, their worlds would collide again under circumstances that would strip away all pretense and force them to confront the consequences of this day's choices. For now, though, they remained in their separate corners of Chicago, Eleanor questioning everything she'd worked for, and the Hamiltons convinced they'd dodged a bullet by avoiding the expertise they desperately needed. The city continued its restless pace around them, indifferent to their personal dramas but somehow poised to deliver the kind of karmic justice that made angels smile and devils take note. 2 weeks after the disastrous consultation, Eleanor was reviewing quarterly reports for Peterson Manufacturing when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was local. She almost let it go to voicemail. She'd been avoiding unknown calls since several reporters had somehow gotten her number after a successful restructuring made the Chicago Tribune's business section. "Washington Financial Consulting, this is Eleanor." "Ms. Washington?" The voice was unfamiliar, professional but strained. "This is Margaret Chun from First National Bank of Chicago. I'm calling regarding Hamilton Textiles." Eleanor's pen stopped moving across her notepad. She hadn't thought about the Hamilton family in days, having thrown herself into other projects to avoid dwelling on their casual cruelty. "I'm sorry, but I'm no longer working with Hamilton Textiles. Yes, I understand there was some disagreement about the consultation. However, circumstances have changed significantly since then. Margaret's voice carried the careful tone of someone delivering bad news to multiple parties. Ms. Washington, Hamilton Textiles has missed their last 2 loan payments. Their stock price has dropped 37% in the past 10 days. We've been trying to work with the family, but they seem unwilling to acknowledge the severity of their situation. Eleanor set down her pen entirely. What exactly are you asking me to do? The bank is prepared to call in their loans unless Hamilton Textiles can present a viable restructuring plan within 72 hours. Robert Hamilton finally admitted they need outside help, and your name is the only one their board will approve. The irony wasn't lost on Eleanor. The same family who had laughed at her expertise now found themselves desperate enough to beg for it. Ms. Chen, I appreciate the call, but I don't think I'm the right fit for the Hamilton family's culture. Ms. Washington, Margaret's voice became more urgent. If Hamilton Textiles fails, 437 people lose their jobs right before the holidays. The ripple effect through their supplier network could impact thousands more. I know what happened in that conference room was unacceptable, but this is bigger than personal feelings now. Eleanor stared out her office window at the November sky, gray clouds gathering like an ominous preview of the winter to come. 437 jobs. Families depending on paychecks that might disappear because of pride and prejudice on both sides. What exactly are the terms? Emergency consultation fee of $50,000, plus standard restructuring percentages if you can save the company. All meetings will be held at our neutral location, the bank's conference facilities on West Monroe. And Ms. Washington? The Hamilton family has been strongly encouraged to focus solely on business matters. Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. The work you do, saving companies, protecting jobs, that's bigger than their ignorance. I'll need complete access to their financial records and the authority to implement changes without family approval. Done. Can you be here at 9 tomorrow morning? Eleanor glanced at her calendar, then at the framed photo on her desk. Her mother in her seamstress uniform, smiling proudly at Eleanor's Northwestern graduation. I'll be there. The next morning, Eleanor stood outside First National Bank of Chicago on West Monroe Street, her burgundy blazer replaced by a charcoal gray suit that felt like armor. She'd spent the previous evening reviewing every piece of public information about Hamilton Textiles' recent struggles. The picture was worse than she'd initially assessed. Their stock had become a penny stock virtually overnight, and industry analysts were openly speculating about bankruptcy. The bank's conference facilities occupied the 15th floor, with modern glass-walled rooms that felt sterile compared to the Hamilton family's opulent headquarters. Eleanor arrived early, claiming a seat with her back to the windows so she could watch the door. At exactly 9 o'clock, Margaret Chen appeared, a petite woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an efficient manner. Ms. Washington, thank you for coming. The Hamilton family should be here momentarily. Margaret's expression suggested she'd had several unpleasant conversations with them over the past few days. I should mention that they're not entirely happy about these arrangements. I imagine not, Eleanor replied dryly. Being forced to accept help from someone they consider beneath them must be quite a blow to their pride. Margaret's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing a hint of satisfaction. Let's just say it's been educational for everyone involved. The conference room door opened, and Eleanor felt her stomach tighten as the Hamilton family filed in. Robert Hamilton looked like he'd aged 5 years in 2 weeks. His silver hair remained perfectly styled, but his face was drawn and his navy suit seemed to hang differently on his frame. The commanding presence that had dominated their previous meeting was noticeably diminished. Catherine followed, her platinum hair still immaculate but her cream-colored dress unable to disguise the tension in her posture. Her usual serene expression had been replaced by barely concealed anxiety, and she avoided making eye contact with Eleanor entirely. The first week of working together passed intense efficiency. Eleanor had commandeered a conference room at First National Bank as her temporary headquarters, the walls now covered with flowcharts, financial projections, and timelines that mapped Hamilton Textiles' path back from the brink. The Hamilton family appeared each morning like reluctant students attending mandatory detention, their previous arrogance replaced by grim necessity. It was during the second week, while reviewing personnel files on a gray November afternoon, that Eleanor discovered something that made her blood run cold. She was cross-referencing employee records with payroll data when a familiar name jumped out at her from a 1987 termination notice: Sandra Williams, her mother's maiden name. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read the sparse details. Terminated for theft. Personal belongings confiscated. No severance pay. The signature at the bottom belonged to Robert Hamilton Sr., the current Robert's father. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother: "Making your favorite pot roast for Sunday dinner. Hope the new project is going well, baby girl." Eleanor stared at the message, her mind reeling. Her mother had never mentioned working for Hamilton Textiles specifically, always speaking generally about sewing for rich families during Eleanor's childhood. But now, pieces of half-remembered conversations began falling into place. Her mother's bitterness when discussing certain wealthy clients, her warnings about families who think money makes them better than everyone else. At 5 o'clock, as the Hamilton family prepared to leave for another evening of denial in their Gold Coast mansion, Eleanor made a decision that would change everything. "I need to speak with you about something," she announced, her voice cutting through their end-of-day shuffle. "All of you. Sit down." Robert looked irritated by her commanding tone, but the family's reduced circumstances had stripped away most of his ability to object. They settled back into their chairs with varying degrees of reluctance. Eleanor placed the 1987 termination notice on the conference table. "I want you to explain this." Robert leaned forward, adjusting his reading glasses. His face went pale as he recognized the document. "Where did you find this?" "In your personnel files. Sandra Williams, accused of theft in 1987, terminated without pay or benefit. Ring any bells?" Catherine glanced at the paper, then at her husband with growing confusion. "Robert, what is this about?" "Sandra Williams," Eleanor continued, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest, "is my mother. And I want to know exactly what she supposedly stole that was worth destroying her livelihood." The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas and Patricia exchanged bewildered glances, clearly hearing this story for the first time. Robert's face had turned ashen, and his hands shook slightly as he reached for the document. "Your mother," he whispered, staring at Eleanor as if seeing her for the first time. "Yes. The woman you accused of theft 36 years ago. The single mother you left without income right before Christmas. I want to know what happened." Robert sat back heavily in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 68 years. I remember that case. There was a bracelet missing from the design office. An expensive piece that belonged to my late wife's collection." Eleanor's heart pounded. "And you automatically assumed the black seamstress took it?" "The evidence seemed clear," Robert said weakly, but his voice lacked conviction. "She was the only one with access to that area after hours." "What evidence?" Eleanor demanded. "Did you find the bracelet in her possession? Did anyone see her take it? Or did you just decide that the poor black woman must be guilty?" Thomas leaned forward, his face troubled. "Father, you never told us about this." "It was handled appropriately," Robert replied, but his defensive tone suggested he knew it hadn't been. "Security procedures were followed." Eleanor laughed bitterly. "Security procedures? You mean racial profiling and jumping to conclusions? Did you ever find the actual thief?" Robert's silence was answer enough. Eleanor felt 36 years of her mother's pain crystallizing into fury. "You destroyed my mother's reputation based on assumptions. She couldn't find work in the garment industry for months because of the rumors you spread. We nearly lost our apartment." Catherine spoke for the first time, her voice barely audible. "Robert, please tell me you had proof." "The bracelet was missing," Robert repeated, but he couldn't meet his wife's eyes. "Someone had to be responsible." "Someone was," Eleanor said coldly. "But it wasn't my mother. And you never bothered to look beyond your own prejudices to find out who it really was." Patricia had been quietly reading the termination notice. "This says she was terminated immediately, with no appeal process. That's not standard procedure, even in 1987. "No," Eleanor agreed. "It's what happens when you're black and poor and no one believes your word against a Hamilton's." Thomas looked sick. Ms. Washington, I had no idea about any of this. Of course you didn't. Your family's casual racism was so ingrained that destroying an innocent woman's livelihood didn't even register as memorable. Eleanor's voice was ice-cold. Do you want to know what my mother did after you fired her? She took in sewing at home, working 18-hour days to keep food on our table. She never spoke badly about your family, never tried to clear her name publicly, because she knew no one would believe her word against yours. Catherine was crying now, delicate tears trailing down her cheeks. I'm so sorry. I had no idea Robert had done such a thing. Didn't you? Eleanor challenged. Or did you just never bother to think about what happened to the people your husband discarded? My mother spent 36 years carrying the shame of being called a thief for something she didn't do. Robert finally found his voice. Eleanor, Ms. Washington, I thought I was protecting my family's property. You were protecting your prejudices. And in the process you stole something far more valuable than any bracelet, my mother's dignity, her reputation, her sense of justice. Eleanor stood up, pacing to the window that overlooked downtown Chicago. Do you want to know the real irony? My mother still has more integrity in her little finger than your entire family has ever possessed. What can we do? Thomas asked quietly. How do we make this right? Eleanor turned back to face them. You can't. You can't give my mother back 36 years of carrying undeserved shame. You can't return the opportunity she lost, the night she cried herself to sleep wondering why no one believed her word. But we can try, Patricia said, her voice thick with emotion. There has to be something. Eleanor studied their faces. Robert's guilt, Catherine's horror, Thomas and Patricia's genuine remorse. For the first time since she'd known them, they looked like human beings rather than caricatures of privilege. There is one thing, she said slowly. A public apology. A formal statement acknowledging that Sandra Williams was wrongfully terminated, that she was innocent of all charges, and that Hamilton Textiles acted on prejudice rather than evidence. Robert winced. A public statement? It would damage the family's reputation. Good, Eleanor replied without hesitation. Your reputation deserves to be damaged. You ruined an innocent woman's life and never looked back. Catherine reached over and took her husband's hand. Robert, it's the right thing to do. We've been living with a lie for 36 years. I was trying to protect the business, Robert said weakly. You were trying to protect your assumptions, Eleanor corrected. And those same assumptions led you to laugh at my expertise 2 weeks ago, nearly destroying the company you claim to love. Thomas looked up sharply. That's why you were so angry during our first meeting. You knew. I suspected. My mother had told me stories about working for families like yours, families who saw her as expendable, whose first instinct was to blame the help when something went wrong. Eleanor's voice softened slightly. But I hoped I was wrong. I hoped that maybe, in 36 years, things had changed. They hadn't, Patricia admitted quietly. We're still the same people who would rather destroy innocent lives than question our own prejudices. Eleanor returned to her seat, the fight draining out of her. The question is, are you willing to change now? Not because you're forced to, but because it's right. Robert looked around the table at his family, his wife's tear-stained face, his children's expressions of shame and determination. Finally, he nodded slowly. Yes, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We'll issue the statement. A full apology to your mother, an acknowledgement of our mistakes, and a commitment to do better. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of possibility. And we'll establish a scholarship fund in her name, Catherine added suddenly. 4 young women from underserved communities who want to pursue business degrees. Eleanor blinked, surprised by the gesture. That would mean something to her. It's not enough, Thomas said firmly. Nothing we do will ever be enough to make up for what we took from her. But we have to try. For the first time since she'd discovered the termination notice, Eleanor allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, people could change when confronted with the full weight of their actions. There's something else, she said quietly. Something you need to understand about why this matters so much. Every day of my childhood, I watched my mother work herself to exhaustion trying to build a better life for us. She never complained, never spoke of bitterness or revenge. She just worked harder, loved deeper, and taught me that our worth isn't determined by what others think of us. Eleanor's voice grew stronger. But she also taught me that when we have the power to fight injustice, we have the responsibility to do so. Today I have that power. The question is, what are you going to do with yours? The Hamilton family sat in silence, finally understanding that their reckoning involved more than financial restructuring. They were being asked to restructure their souls. The atmosphere in the bank conference room had shifted dramatically after Eleanor's revelation about her mother. The next morning, when the Hamilton family arrived, they carried themselves differently, shoulders less rigid, eyes less guarded. Robert entered first, his silver hair slightly disheveled as if he'd spent a sleepless night wrestling with demons. He carried a manila folder in his hands like an offering. "Eleanor," he said, using her first name for the first time, "I stayed up all night going through old files. I found something you need to see." He placed the folder on the conference table with trembling hand. Inside were police reports from December 1987, witness statements, and a confession letter written in careful cursive handwriting. Eleanor's breath caught as she read the confession. Jennifer Morrison, 19, admits to taking Mrs. Hamilton's diamond bracelet from the design office to pay for her brother's medical bills. "My father's secretary's daughter," Robert said quietly. "She confessed 3 weeks after we fired your mother. She'd hidden the bracelet in her mother's jewelry box, planning to return it after pawning it temporarily. When she heard about your mother's termination, she couldn't live with the guilt." Eleanor stared at the confession, her hands shaking. 3 weeks. You knew my mother was innocent 3 weeks later, and you never called her back. Catherine entered the room carrying a tray with coffee and what looked like homemade blueberry muffins. Her platinum hair was pulled back simply, and she wore a soft lavender sweater instead of her usual formal attire. "I made these this morning," she said quietly. "My grandmother's recipe. I hoped we might try to start over." The gesture was so unexpected, so genuinely humble, that Eleanor found herself accepting a muffin despite her emotional turmoil. "Why didn't you contact my mother after Jennifer confessed?" Robert sank into his chair heavily. "Pride. Cowardice. Fear of admitting we'd been wrong." His voice cracked slightly. "I convinced myself that the damage was already done, that reopening the matter would only cause more pain." Thomas entered carrying his laptop and a stack of legal documents. His usually perfect appearance was rumpled, his tie loosened, his brown hair uncombed. "I've been working with our attorneys all night. We're preparing a formal exoneration letter for your mother, a public statement for the media, and the paperwork to establish the Sandra Williams Scholarship Fund." Eleanor looked around the table, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time. Not as caricatures of privilege, but as deeply flawed human beings struggling with the weight of their mistakes. Patricia was the last to arrive, and she looked like she'd been crying. Her auburn hair hung loose around her shoulders, and she wore jeans and a simple green sweater, the first time Eleanor had seen her in anything other than designer business attire. "I called my therapist last night," Patricia said without preamble. "We had a long conversation about inherited racism and the ways privilege blinds us to our own cruelty." She paused, meeting Eleanor's eyes directly. "I've never examined my assumptions about people who don't look like me. I just accepted the worldview I was raised with." Eleanor felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. "It's not easy to question everything you've been taught." "No, but that's not an excuse," Patricia replied firmly. "I'm 38 years old. I should have developed my own moral compass by now." Catherine sat down beside Eleanor, closer than she'd ever sat before. "May I ask about your mother? What she's like?" Eleanor hesitated, then found herself describing Sandra Williams, her quiet strength, her determination to create beauty even in difficult circumstances, her unwavering faith in justice despite experiencing so little of it. "She sounds remarkable," Catherine said softly. "I would very much like to meet her, if she'd be willing." "I don't know if she's ready for that," Eleanor admitted. "This whole situation has brought up painful memories for her." Robert cleared his throat. "Eleanor, there's something else. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about the way we treated you during our first meeting. About how our behavior toward you was connected to what we did to your mother." Eleanor waited, sensing he was struggling to articulate something important. "I spent my whole life believing that success meant never admitting weakness or uncertainty. My father taught me that showing vulnerability was dangerous in business, that people would take advantage of any crack in our armor. Robert's voice grew quieter. I think I confused arrogance with strength, prejudice with protection. Thomas nodded slowly. We all did. When you walked into our conference room with expertise we didn't possess, it threatened our entire identity. Instead of recognizing your value, we attacked your credibility. Because it was easier than admitting we needed help, Patricia added. Especially help from someone who represented everything we'd been taught to dismiss. Eleanor found herself leaning forward, engaged despite herself. But why? Why was it so important to maintain that illusion of superiority? Catherine answered, her voice barely above a whisper. Because without it, we'd have to face the truth about ourselves. That we're not special, not inherently better than anyone else. That our success came from luck and inheritance, not merit. The honesty was raw, painful, and completely unlike anything Eleanor had expected from the Hamilton family. She realized she was seeing them without their masks for the first time. There's something I haven't told you, Eleanor said slowly. About why I became a financial consultant. She paused, gathering courage. When I was 12, my mother lost her job at another textile company. Different family, same story. Something went missing, blame the black employee. We were evicted from our apartment and had to move in with my grandmother in a neighborhood where gunshots were more common than lullabies. The room was completely silent. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. My mother never complained, never spoke bitterly about the families who dismissed her. But I watched her spirit break a little more each time it happened. I decided that someday, I would have enough knowledge and power to protect people like her. Thomas leaned forward. Is that why you specialize in saving struggling companies? To protect employees from losing their jobs. Eleanor nodded. Every restructuring I do, I think about the families who depend on those paychecks. The children who need their parents to keep working. The dreams that die when companies fail. Like our employees, Patricia said quietly. The 437 people whose jobs we put at risk because of our pride. Yes, Eleanor confirmed. Exactly like them. Robert stood up suddenly and walked to the window, his back to the group. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I've been thinking about Jennifer Morrison, the girl who actually took the bracelet. She was 19, desperate to help her sick brother, working for minimum wage while her family faced medical bankruptcy. He turned back to face them. Your mother was probably around the same age, trying to support you as a single parent, working multiple jobs to make ends meet. And I destroyed her livelihood because I couldn't imagine that someone who looked like my family might be the real culprit. Catherine reached over and took Eleanor's hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. What can we do to honor your mother's strength? How do we make sure her story isn't forgotten? Eleanor felt tears threatening. You're already doing it. By admitting the truth. By changing. By treating the people who work for you with dignity instead of suspicion. Thomas opened his laptop. I've been researching your other cases. Peterson Manufacturing, Collins Automotive, Brennan Industries. Do you know what they all have in common? Eleanor shook her head. They all implemented diversity training and bias awareness programs as part of their restructuring. You've been fighting this battle everywhere you go, haven't you? Eleanor smiled sadly. Someone has to. Systemic problems require systematic solutions. Patricia reached into her purse and pulled out a worn business card. This is my therapist's information. She specializes in helping people unlearn inherited prejudices. I was thinking, maybe our whole family should start seeing her. The gesture was so genuine, so vulnerable, that Eleanor felt her carefully maintained professional distance beginning to crumble. These people were starting to feel less like former adversaries and more like something she wasn't ready to name yet. There's one more thing, Robert said, returning to his seat. About the company's future. If we survive this crisis, I want you to consider staying on permanently. Not just as a consultant but as a partner. Equal ownership, equal decision-making authority. Eleanor blinked in surprise. Robert, I don't think. I'm serious. Hamilton Textiles needs to change fundamentally, and you're the only person I trust to guide that change. Plus, he added with the first genuine smile she'd seen from him, it would drive the old guard at the country club absolutely crazy. Catherine laughed. A real laugh, not the affected tinkle Eleanor remembered from their first meeting. Oh, Robert, the look on Martha Peterson's face would be priceless. For a moment, the conference room filled with something Eleanor hadn't expected: genuine warmth. Not the polite professional courtesy she'd been maintaining, but actual human connection. Thomas pulled up a financial projection on his laptop. Eleanor, look at this. If we implement your full restructuring plan and you stay on as partner, we could not only save the company but position it for major growth. The textile industry needs innovation, and your background gives you insights we never would have developed. Eleanor studied the numbers, her analytical mind automatically calculating possibilities. The sustainable textile market is growing by 30% annually. If Hamilton Textiles positioned itself as a leader in ethical manufacturing. Exactly, Patricia said excitedly. We could honor our legacy while building something completely new. Something that reflects values instead of just profit margins. Eleanor felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest, not just professional satisfaction, but genuine affection for these complicated, damaged, evolving people. They were offering her something she'd never expected. True partnership, not just token inclusion. I need to think about it, she said honestly. And I need to talk to my mother. This decision affects her too. Robert nodded respectfully. Of course. Take all the time you need. As they returned to the day's work, reviewing supplier contracts, analyzing market trends, preparing presentations for creditors, Eleanor noticed how different the dynamics felt. Instead of barely tolerated necessity, their collaboration had become something approaching genuine teamwork. Catherine brought lunch from a nearby deli, choosing a soul food restaurant that served Eleanor's favorite cornbread. Thomas asked thoughtful questions about her restructuring methodology, genuinely interested in learning from her expertise. Patricia shared stories about her volunteer work with literacy programs, revealing a depth of character Eleanor hadn't suspected. But it was Robert who surprised her most. During a break in their afternoon session, he approached her privately. Eleanor, I want you to know that what we're building here, this partnership, this respect, it's not about assuaging our guilt or protecting our business. It's because you've shown us what real leadership looks like. Eleanor looked into his eyes, searching for manipulation or calculation, but found only sincere admiration. I'm not perfect, she reminded him. I make mistakes, I have blind spots, I can be stubborn and demanding. Robert chuckled. Welcome to humanity. The difference is, you've earned your confidence through competence, while we inherited ours through accident of birth. As evening approached and they prepared to leave, Eleanor realized something had fundamentally shifted. The Hamilton family was no longer just her clients or her adversaries. They were becoming something far more complicated and infinitely more hopeful. Eleanor arrived at the bank conference room the following Monday morning with renewed energy and a carefully prepared presentation for the creditors' meeting scheduled for later that week. The weekend had been spent refining their restructuring proposal, and for the first time since taking on the Hamilton account, she felt genuinely optimistic about their chances of success. The morning Chicago sun streamed through the conference room windows as she arranged her materials, humming softly, something she hadn't done in weeks. The Hamilton family had shown remarkable growth over the past few days, and their collaboration had evolved into something that felt almost like friendship. Catherine arrived first, carrying her usual tray of coffee and homemade pastries. She'd taken to bringing breakfast every morning, a gesture that had evolved from awkward peace offering to genuine care. Her platinum hair was styled more casually now, and she wore a soft blue sweater that made her look approachable rather than intimidating. Good morning, Eleanor, she said warmly, setting down the tray. I brought those lemon scones you mentioned liking. You didn't have to do that, Eleanor replied, but she was smiling as she accepted the offering. The scones were perfect, tart and sweet, made with obvious care. Robert entered next, looking more energetic than he had in weeks. His silver hair was perfectly styled again, but his demeanor remained humble, transformed by their recent conversations. He carried a newspaper under his arm and wore an expression of quiet pride. Eleanor, have you seen the Tribune this morning? He asked, spreading the business section across the table. There's an article about companies successfully restructuring during economic downturns. Hamilton Textiles is mentioned as an example of innovative crisis management. Eleanor scanned the article, pleased to see their efforts getting positive attention. The journalist had focused on their sustainable manufacturing initiatives and their commitment to retaining employees through strategic restructuring. Thomas arrived carrying his laptop and a stack of contracts from potential new suppliers. His brown hair was neatly combed, and he wore a charcoal suit that made him look professional but approachable. The arrogant young executive Eleanor had first met had been replaced by someone genuinely committed to learning and growth. "The renewable textile suppliers are very interested in partnering with us," he reported, settling into his usual seat. "3 of them are willing to offer preferential pricing in exchange for long-term contracts." Patricia was the last to arrive, and Eleanor immediately noticed something was wrong. Her auburn hair was pulled back severely, her emerald dress was more formal than the casual clothes she'd been wearing lately, and her face wore an expression Eleanor hadn't seen since their first disastrous meeting. "Good morning," Patricia said stiffly, taking her seat without making eye contact with anyone. "Everything all right?" Catherine asked, clearly noticing her daughter's changed demeanor. Patricia's response was to pull out her phone and place it on the table. The screen displayed a voice recording app, and Eleanor could see that a conversation had been recorded the previous Friday evening. "I think everyone needs to hear this," Patricia said, her voice cold and distant. She pressed play. The recording crackled to life, filled with the ambient noise of what sounded like an upscale restaurant. Eleanor heard Robert's voice first, speaking in the casual tone of someone who believed his conversation was private. "The whole thing is quite remarkable, actually. We've managed to turn a complete disaster into a public relations victory." Thomas's voice joined in. "I have to admit, bringing Eleanor in was brilliant strategy. Having a black woman save the company makes us look progressive and socially conscious." Eleanor felt ice forming in her stomach as she listened to the conversation she'd never been meant to hear. Catherine's voice was audible next. "The media loves these kinds of stories. Wealthy white family learns from wise woman of color. It's like something out of a movie." Robert's laughter followed. "The best part is how authentic it all looks. Eleanor actually believes we've changed, that we've learned some profound lesson about prejudice and humanity." Thomas again. "She's so earnest about it too. Did you see her face when we offered the partnership? She actually thinks we respect her as an equal." The recording continued for another excruciating minute, filled with casual mockery of Eleanor's emotional investment in their apparent transformation. They discussed how her diversity angle would help them win contracts with companies that prioritized social responsibility. They laughed about her mother's story, calling it perfectly dramatic for their public narrative. Patricia stopped the recording and looked around the table with disgust. "I recorded this Friday night at the university club. You 3 were having dinner, celebrating how cleverly you'd manipulated Eleanor into saving the company while making yourselves look good." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor stared at the phone as if it were a poisonous snake, her mind struggling to process what she'd just heard. Every moment of apparent connection, every gesture of respect, every sign of growth, all of it had been calculated performance. Catherine's face had gone pale. "Patricia, why would you?" "Because I've been in therapy," Patricia exploded, her composure finally cracking. "Because I've been doing the actual work of examining my prejudices and trying to become a better person, and while I was struggling with real change, you 3 were plotting to use Eleanor's expertise and her story for your own benefit." Robert's commanding presence had returned, but now it felt sinister rather than authoritative. "Patricia, you're overreacting. We were simply discussing strategy." "Strategy?" Eleanor's voice cut through the room like a blade. She stood slowly, her hands shaking with rage and humiliation. "Is that what you call it?" She looked around the table, seeing them clearly for the first time since their supposed transformation began. The humble expressions, the genuine seeming remorse, the offers of partnership, all of it had been elaborate theater designed to secure her services while positioning themselves as enlightened employers. "The apologies," Eleanor said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "The personal stories. The scholarship fund. All of it was just manipulation." Thomas had the decency to look ashamed, but Robert and Catherine maintained their composure with the practiced ease of people accustomed to being caught in their machinations. "Eleanor, you have to understand," Catherine began in her refined voice, Business requires certain strategies. We genuinely do appreciate your expertise. Appreciate. Eleanor laughed, but the sound was bitter and hollow. You appreciate how my expertise can save your company while my story makes you look progressive. You appreciate how my mother's suffering can be turned into positive publicity for your family. She began gathering her materials with sharp, angry movements. You know what the most pathetic part is? I actually started to care about you. I started to believe that people could change, that understanding could bridge differences. Patricia stood up suddenly. Eleanor, please don't let their manipulation poison everything. Some of us were genuine. Were you? Eleanor spun to face her. Or are you just playing a different role in the same performance? The enlightened daughter who records her family's racism to prove she's different. Patricia's face crumpled. That's not. I was trying to protect you. By exposing me to their mockery? By making me listen to them laugh about my naivety? Eleanor's professional composure had completely shattered, replaced by raw hurt and fury. You could have warned me privately. Instead, you chose the most humiliating possible revelation. Robert cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. Eleanor, let's not allow emotions to cloud our judgment. The business arrangement remains beneficial for all parties. Business arrangement? Eleanor's voice rose to a level that made everyone flinch. Is that what you think this is? A simple transaction where you get to save your company while treating me like a performing monkey? She slammed her portfolio shut and headed for the door. Here's some free advice for your business arrangement. Hamilton Textiles will be bankrupt within 6 weeks whether I help you or not. But now, instead of failing because of market forces, you'll fail because of your own moral bankruptcy. Thomas jumped up from his seat. Eleanor, wait. We can fix this. We can make it right. Eleanor turned back, her dark eyes blazing with contempt. Make it right? You've spent the last week pretending to be decent human beings while secretly mocking everything I shared with you. You turned my mother's pain into a public relations opportunity and my professional expertise into a diversity showcase. Catherine stood as well, her elegant facade cracking under the weight of Eleanor's accusations. We never meant for you to find out. There it is, Eleanor said with savage satisfaction. The truth finally. You never meant for me to find out. Not that you were sorry, not that you'd changed, just that you never meant to get caught. She looked around the room one final time, memorizing their faces. Robert's calculating coldness, Catherine's refined cruelty, Thomas's weak-willed complicity, and Patricia's misguided attempt at moral superiority. You want to know what's truly sad? Eleanor said, her voice now dangerously quiet. I could have saved your company. I could have preserved every single job, modernized your operations, and positioned Hamilton Textiles for decades of success. But you were so consumed with maintaining your sense of superiority that you couldn't accept help without turning it into a performance. She opened the door and paused. When your employees lose their jobs, when your suppliers go unpaid, when your family name becomes synonymous with failure, remember this moment. Remember that you had salvation standing right in front of you, and you chose to mock it instead of embrace it. Eleanor walked out of the conference room, leaving behind the sound of Patricia crying, Thomas cursing under his breath, and Robert demanding that someone fix this situation immediately. The elevator ride down 15 floors felt like falling through the center of the earth. Eleanor's reflection in the polished steel showed a woman whose professional armor had been completely shattered, revealing wounds that might never fully heal. By the time she reached the bank lobby, tears were streaming down her face. The security guard at the front desk looked concerned, but Eleanor walked past him without explanation. Outside, the November wind cut through her charcoal suit like knives, but she barely felt the cold. Her phone was already ringing, probably Margaret Chen wanting an update on the Hamilton situation. Eleanor turned it off without looking. She needed time to process the magnitude of the betrayal, to understand how she'd been so completely fooled by people whose capacity for cruelty apparently knew no bounds. Behind her, 15 floors up, the Hamilton family was discovering that some bridges, once burned, could never be rebuilt. And some opportunities, once squandered, never came again. The November sky above Chicago seemed to mirror Eleanor's emotional state, gray, heavy with the promise of storms, and absolutely unforgiving. Trust broken can sometimes be repaired, but trust betrayed leaves scars that last forever. Eleanor sat in her Honda Civic in the parking garage beneath her Lincoln Park apartment, the engine off, her hands still gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. The November afternoon had turned gray and bitter, matching the storm raging in her chest. She'd been sitting there for 20 minutes, unable to summon the energy to climb 3 flights of stairs to an apartment that no longer felt like sanctuary. Her phone buzzed incessantly on the passenger seat. Missed calls from Margaret Chen, from her assistant, from clients whose projects suddenly seemed meaningless in the wake of the Hamilton betrayal. But Eleanor couldn't bring herself to answer. How do you explain to people that you've been played by experts, that your belief in human decency had been weaponized against you? The recording played in her mind on endless repeat. Eleanor actually believes we've changed, that we've learned some profound lesson about prejudice and humanity. Robert's laughter echoed in the concrete garage like a haunting. She's so earnest about it too. Eleanor finally forced herself out of the car and up the stairs, each step feeling like climbing a mountain. Her burgundy blazer from that first disastrous meeting hung in her closet like evidence of her naivety. She'd believed she could change people, that expertise and competence could overcome prejudice. Instead, she'd discovered that some people were willing to use even her pain as a tool for their own advancement. Her apartment felt different now, smaller, somehow tainted by the knowledge that while she'd been sharing stories about her mother's struggles, the Hamilton family had been calculating how to monetize her trauma. The framed photo of her mother at Northwestern graduation seemed to mock her now. What would Sandra Washington think of her daughter being manipulated so completely? Eleanor's phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed her mother's number, and somehow Sandra's timing was perfect as always. Eleanor almost didn't answer, afraid that her voice would betray the depth of her humiliation, but her mother's worry would only grow if calls went unanswered. "Hey, Mama," Eleanor said, trying to inject normalcy into her voice. "Baby girl, what's wrong? You sound like somebody died." Eleanor almost laughed at the accuracy of the assessment. Something had died today, her faith in redemption, her belief that people could genuinely change, her confidence in her own judgment. "Just having a rough day with that difficult client I mentioned." Sandra was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor could picture her in her Bronzeville apartment, probably folding laundry or preparing dinner, her weathered hands moving with the precision of decades of careful work. "Eleanor, let me tell you something about difficult people," Sandra said finally. "Sometimes they're difficult because they're hurting. Sometimes they're difficult because they're scared. And sometimes, baby girl, they're just difficult because they're mean." The simple wisdom hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She'd spent weeks trying to understand the Hamilton family's behavior, making excuses for their prejudice, believing their apparent transformation. But maybe the truth was simpler. Maybe they were just cruel people who enjoyed their cruelty. "Mama, what if someone used your stories against you? What if they pretended to care about your struggles, just to benefit themselves?" Sandra's intake of breath was sharp. "Who did that to you, Eleanor? It doesn't matter now. They got what they needed from me, and I got a lesson in human nature I won't soon forget. Baby, listen to me carefully." Sandra's voice carried the authority that had guided Eleanor through childhood's scraped knees and teenage heartbreaks. "When people show you who they really are, believe them. Don't waste your precious energy trying to save folks who don't want to be saved. But don't let their poison change who you are either." Eleanor felt tears threatening again. "I feel so stupid, Mama. I thought I was helping them become better people, but they were just using me the whole time." "You're not stupid for having hope. You're not naive for believing in people's capacity to change. That's what makes you good at what you do. You see potential where others see problems." "But what if I can't trust my judgment anymore? What if I'm wrong about everyone?" Sandra was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of lived experience. "Eleanor, I worked for families like that for 30 years. Rich folks who saw me as invisible, who talked about me like I wasn't standing right there. And you know what I learned?" "What?" "Their opinion of me never changed my worth. Their blindness never diminished my value. And their cruelty never became my fault." Sandra's voice grew stronger. "Baby girl, you offered them salvation, and they chose mockery instead. That's not a reflection of your judgment, that's a revelation of their character." After hanging up with her mother, Eleanor sat in her living room as afternoon faded into evening. The city lights began twinkling beyond her windows, and she thought about the hundreds of people whose jobs hung in the balance while the Hamilton family played their manipulative games. Her laptop sat open on the coffee table, displaying the restructuring plan that could save Hamilton Textiles. Months of work, innovative solutions, carefully crafted strategies that addressed every aspect of their financial crisis. Eleanor knew she could walk away and watch the company crumble, taking with it the jobs of people who had nothing to do with their employer's moral bankruptcy. But those employees didn't deserve to suffer because their bosses were terrible people. The seamstresses working the factory floor, the warehouse workers loading trucks, the administrative assistants answering phones. They had families, mortgages, dreams that shouldn't be sacrificed to Eleanor's wounded pride. Meanwhile, across town in the Gold Coast, the Hamilton family was having their own reckoning in the library of their mansion. The room's dark wood paneling and oil paintings of previous generations seemed to judge them as they faced the consequences of their betrayal. Robert stood by the marble fireplace, but there was no whiskey in his hand tonight. His silver hair was disheveled for the first time in years, and his navy suit was wrinkled from a day of crisis management. The commanding presence that had dominated boardrooms for decades had crumbled under the weight of his own moral failure. Catherine sat in her burgundy velvet armchair, but her usual elegant composure had deserted her. Her platinum hair was coming loose from its perfect styling, and her cream-colored dress was creased from hours of anxious sitting. The refined woman who had casually dismissed Eleanor's expertise now looked hollow and defeated. Thomas paced by the windows, his brown hair wild from running his hands through it repeatedly. His expensive suit couldn't hide the fact that he looked physically ill, his face pale with the realization of what they'd lost. The confident young executive had been replaced by someone who understood, perhaps for the first time, the true cost of inherited privilege. Patricia remained in the corner, her emerald dress a splash of color in a room that felt drained of life. Her auburn hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her face was streaked with tears she'd been shedding since the morning's revelation. The recording that had seemed like an act of moral courage now felt like a nuclear bomb that had destroyed everything in its wake. Eleanor was right, Thomas said finally, breaking the heavy silence. We are morally bankrupt. Robert's voice was hoarse when he replied. We've lost everything. The company, our reputation, any chance of redemption. All because we couldn't accept help without turning it into a performance. Catherine spoke for the first time in hours, her refined voice barely above a whisper. I keep thinking about her mother's story. About working for families like us, being invisible, being dismissed. And we did exactly what those families did. Patricia looked up from her corner, her eyes red with crying. I thought I was protecting her by exposing the truth. But I just humiliated her in the worst possible way. The room fell silent again as each family member grappled with their individual failures. Robert had orchestrated the manipulation with the calculating coldness of someone accustomed to using people as tools. Catherine had participated with the casual cruelty of inherited entitlement. Thomas had gone along with weak-willed complicity that was perhaps the most disappointing of all. And Patricia, who had genuinely started therapy, who had begun examining her own prejudices, had chosen public revelation over private protection, prioritizing her own moral positioning over Eleanor's dignity. We need to fix this, Thomas said suddenly. We need to make this right. Robert laughed bitterly. Fix it? How do you fix trust that's been completely shattered? How do you apologize for weaponizing someone's pain? I don't know, Thomas replied. But we have to try. 400 people are going to lose their jobs because of our moral failure. Catherine stirred in her chair. Eleanor was saving us, and we repaid her with betrayal. She offered us genuine transformation, and we chose calculated performance instead. Patricia wiped her eyes and stood up suddenly. Then we have to prove we can actually change. Not for show, not for public relations, but because it's right. How? Robert asked, his voice hollow. Eleanor will never trust us again. Why should she? Because, Patricia said with growing conviction, maybe this isn't about earning her trust back. Maybe this is about becoming people who deserve trust, whether she gives it to us or not. The family looked at each other across the library that had witnessed generations of Hamilton decisions. Tonight, they faced a choice that would define not just their company's future, but their own moral legacy. They could accept their failure and let Hamilton Textiles collapse, taking with it the jobs and livelihoods of hundreds of innocent people. Or they could find a way to prove that genuine transformation was possible, even for people who had sunk as low as they had. The choice would require them to abandon the privilege and entitlement that had shaped their entire life. It would mean accepting consequences without expecting forgiveness, making amends without guaranteed redemption. But as they sat in their mansion surrounded by the trappings of inherited wealth, the Hamilton family began to understand that their real choice wasn't between saving face or losing money. It was between remaining the people they had always been or becoming the people they had only pretended to be. The November wind rattled the library windows like a reminder that some storms, once unleashed, change everything in their path. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, they change you for the better. When everything falls apart, that's when we discover who we really are. 3 days after the devastating revelation, Eleanor stood in her apartment kitchen at dawn, watching the December sun struggle through Chicago's gray winter sky. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. Their opinion of me never changed my worth. She'd made her decision during the long, sleepless hours of the previous night, and now she needed to act before doubt could weaken her resolve. Her phone showed 17 missed calls from Margaret Chin, but Eleanor had more important calls to make first. She dialed Hamilton Textiles directly, bypassing the family entirely to reach Karen Rodriguez, the floor supervisor she'd met during her facility tour. "Karen? This is Eleanor Washington, the consultant who's been working with the Hamilton family. I need you to gather all the floor supervisors and department heads in conference room B at 9 this morning. Don't inform the Hamilton family. This meeting is for employees only." 2 hours later, Eleanor stood before 43 Hamilton Textiles employees in a conference room that hadn't seen management in months. These were the people who actually made the company run. Seamstresses, warehouse workers, quality control inspectors, administrative assistants. Their faces reflected the anxiety of workers who had watched their company's stock price plummet while their bosses offered no explanations. Karen Rodriguez, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and calloused hands that spoke of decades at industrial sewing machines, served as unofficial spokesperson. "Ms. Washington, we heard you were helping save our jobs. Is that true?" Eleanor looked around the room, seeing faces that reminded her of her mother's colleagues from the garment district. Hard-working people whose livelihoods depended on decisions made by others, whose expertise was often overlooked because they didn't wear expensive suits or have Ivy League degrees. "The Hamilton family hired me to restructure the company," Eleanor said carefully. "I developed a plan that would preserve most jobs while making Hamilton Textiles profitable again. However, my working relationship with the family has ended." A murmur of concern rippled through the room. Marcus Thompson, a warehouse supervisor in his 40s, raised his hand. "Does that mean we're all getting laid off?" Eleanor took a deep breath. "Not if I can help it. I'm here to offer you something unprecedented: employee ownership." The room fell silent as Eleanor opened her laptop and displayed a presentation she'd worked on all night. "I've been in contact with several investors who are interested in backing an employee buyout of Hamilton Textiles. With the stock price so low, a consortium of workers could purchase controlling interest for less than the cost of one Hamilton family vacation." Karen leaned forward, her dark eyes intense. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A cooperative model where every employee becomes a shareholder. Management decisions would be made democratically, profits would be shared equitably, and the company would be run by people who actually understand the work." Eleanor clicked to the next slide. "I'm willing to provide consulting services at cost to make this transition happen." The room erupted in excited conversation as employees began to grasp the magnitude of what Eleanor was offering. She wasn't just saving their jobs, she was giving them ownership of their own destiny. Maria Santos, a seamstress who had worked at Hamilton Textiles for 15 years, stood up. "Ms. Washington, why would you do this for us? You don't even know us." Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Because my mother spent 30 years working for families like the Hamiltons. She understood that the real value of any company comes from the people who show up every day and do the work. You deserve better than employers who see you as expendable." Meanwhile, the Hamilton family was discovering the full extent of their isolation. At their emergency board meeting that morning, Robert faced a room full of investors and board members who had lost patience with his leadership. Board Chairman William Morrison, a distinguished man in his 70s who had been Robert's mentor for decades, delivered the verdict with surgical precision. "Robert, the board has lost confidence in your ability to navigate this crisis. We're calling for your immediate resignation as CEO." Robert sat at the head of the mahogany conference table in Hamilton Textiles headquarters, the same room where Eleanor had first presented her analysis. The irony wasn't lost on him. The very expertise he had mocked was now the company's only hope for survival. "What about Eleanor Washington?" Thomas asked desperately. "Can't we convince her to come back?" Morrison's expression was grim. "Ms. Washington has declined all our calls. Her assistant informed us that she's pursuing alternative solutions for the Hamilton Textiles situation." Catherine, who had insisted on attending the board meeting despite not holding an official position, spoke up with the desperation of someone watching her world crumble. "Alternative solutions? What does that mean?" Morrison consulted his note. "Our sources indicate she's organizing some kind of employee buyout. If successful, the Hamilton family would retain minimal ownership while workers take control of day-to-day operations." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The Hamilton Empire, built over nearly a century, would effectively pass into the hands of the very people they had spent generations overlooking and dismissing. Patricia, who had been silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke. "Maybe that's what should happen. Maybe the company belongs with people who actually value it." Robert stared at his daughter as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. "Patricia, this company is our legacy. It's been in our family for 4 generations. Our legacy," Patricia replied quietly, "is treating people like Eleanor Washington with casual cruelty. Our legacy is dismissing expertise because it comes from someone who doesn't look like us. Maybe it's time for a different kind of legacy." Later that afternoon, Eleanor received an unexpected visitor. She was reviewing buyout paperwork in her apartment when her building's buzzer rang. The voice that came through the intercom was barely recognizable. "Eleanor? It's Patricia Hamilton. Please, I just need 5 minutes." Eleanor almost refused, but curiosity won over caution. When she opened her apartment door, she found Patricia Hamilton looking nothing like the polished socialite from their first meeting. Her auburn hair was uncombed, her face was puffy from crying, and she wore jeans and a simple sweater instead of designer clothes. "I know you have no reason to listen to me," Patricia began, her voice hoarse. "But I needed to tell you something before everything ends." Eleanor gestured her inside but remained standing, arms crossed defensively. "You have 5 minutes." Patricia looked around Eleanor's apartment, the carefully chosen furniture, the framed degrees, the photos of Sandra Washington at various milestones in Eleanor's life. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "I've been in therapy for 6 months, trying to understand why I was raised to see people like you as somehow less worthy of respect. My therapist helped me realize that my whole family operates from a foundation of inherited supremacy that we never questioned." Eleanor remained silent, watching Patricia struggle with words that clearly didn't come easily. "When I recorded my family that night, I thought I was protecting you. But my therapist helped me understand that I was actually protecting myself, proving that I was different, that I was better than them. I used your pain to establish my own moral superiority." Patricia wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture that seemed remarkably human compared to her usual polished composure. "The truth is, I was just as manipulative as they were. I just told myself a different story about my motives." Eleanor studied Patricia's face, searching for signs of performance or calculation. Instead, she saw something she'd never seen from any Hamilton family member: genuine shame and authentic remorse. "Why are you telling me this?" Eleanor asked. "Because you deserved better from all of us. Because your mother deserved better from families like mine. Because 400 people are going to lose their jobs because we couldn't see past our own prejudice." Patricia's voice broke. "And because I wanted you to know that some of us are capable of real change, even if it's too late to matter." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness, exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. "Patricia, what your family did was inexcusable. The manipulation, the mockery, the casual racism, none of that can be undone." "I know," Patricia whispered. But, Eleanor continued, her voice softening slightly, recognizing your own complicity is the first step toward becoming someone different. The question is whether you're willing to do the work even when no one's watching, even when there's no reward for changing. Patricia looked up with desperate hope. How do I do that? How do I become someone worthy of the forgiveness I'll never receive? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, thinking of her mother's journey from bitter experience to hard-won wisdom. You start by using whatever privilege you have to lift up people who don't have it. You spend the rest of your life proving that your transformation was real, not with words but with actions. As Patricia prepared to leave, she turned back one final time. Eleanor? The employee buyout, is it really going to work? Eleanor's smile was the first genuine expression of joy Patricia had seen from her. It's going to be beautiful. Those workers know that company better than your family ever did. They have ideas for innovation, for efficiency, for treating customers and each other with respect. Hamilton Textiles is going to thrive under their leadership. Patricia nodded, understanding that she was witnessing the birth of something far better than what her family had built. I'm glad. They deserve better than what we gave them. 6 months later, Hamilton Textiles, now officially renamed Textile Workers Cooperative, was featured on the cover of Chicago Business Magazine. The story detailed how employee ownership had transformed a failing company into a model of sustainable manufacturing and equitable profit sharing. Eleanor stood in the company's renovated headquarters on a warm June morning, watching Karen Rodriguez address a room full of international business students who had come to study their cooperative model. The former floor supervisor wore a professional blazer now, her silver hair styled confidently as she explained their democratic decision-making process. Ms. Washington believed in us when no one else would, Karen was saying. She didn't just save our jobs, she gave us ownership of our own futures. Eleanor smiled, remembering her mother's words about seeing potential where others see problems. The workers had exceeded every projection, implementing innovations that the Hamilton family had never considered and building relationships with suppliers based on mutual respect rather than inherited entitlement. Marcus Thompson, now the elected facility manager, joined Eleanor by the window. We got the sustainability contract with Morrison Industries, he reported, his pride evident. They specifically cited our worker-owned model as a factor in their decision. Eleanor nodded, feeling the deep satisfaction that came from work that aligned with her values. What about the new apprenticeship program? Fully enrolled. We're partnering with 3 high schools in underserved neighborhoods to create paid pathways into textile manufacturing. The board voted to prioritize applicants whose parents work in service industries. The irony was perfect. The company that had once dismissed Eleanor because of her mother's background now prioritized children of seamstresses, housekeepers, and maintenance workers. Justice had a way of completing its own circles. Eleanor's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Saw the magazine article. You were right about everything. PH. She looked out the window toward downtown Chicago, wondering where Patricia Hamilton was now and whether her transformation had proven as durable as the worker cooperative's success. Some questions, Eleanor had learned, didn't need immediate answers. That evening, Eleanor visited her mother in Bronzeville, carrying a copy of the magazine article and a bottle of Sandra's favorite wine. They sat on Sandra's small porch, watching neighborhood children play in the summer twilight. Read me the good part again, Sandra requested, settling back in her chair with obvious contentment. Eleanor found the passage and read aloud. Under employee ownership, Textile Workers Cooperative has achieved something unprecedented, a business model that prioritizes human dignity alongside profitability. Consultant Eleanor Washington's innovative approach proves that the most sustainable companies are those owned by the people who actually do the work. Sandra sipped her wine and smiled. Your daddy would be proud, baby girl. You took all that pain they caused you and turned it into something beautiful. Eleanor thought about the Hamilton family, scattered now to different cities and different lives. Robert had moved to Florida, his empire reduced to bitter memories and cautionary tales. Catherine had retreated to their summer home in Wisconsin, avoiding Chicago society that now whispered about the family's spectacular fall. Thomas had taken a job with a consulting firm in New York, starting over with the humility that comes from watching your assumptions crumble. And Patricia had surprised everyone by enrolling in a master's program in social work, dedicating herself to studying systemic inequality and restorative justice. Her quarterly updates to Eleanor were brief but consistent, documenting a transformation that seemed genuine in its lack of seeking recognition. "Mama," Eleanor said as the summer sky deepened toward night, "do you think people can really change?" Sandra was quiet for a moment, her weathered hands folding the magazine carefully. "Some can, baby girl. Some can't. But the ones who really change don't need you to believe in them, they just keep doing the work until the change becomes who they are." Eleanor nodded, thinking of the workers who had risen to leadership roles they'd never been offered under Hamilton family management. Change was possible, but it required courage, humility, and the willingness to rebuild yourself from the foundation up. As they sat together on the porch, mother and daughter, Eleanor felt the deep peace that comes from work that honors both justice and mercy. She had taken the Hamilton family's cruelty and transformed it into opportunity for people who had never been given chances to lead. The textile cooperative would outlast the Hamilton name, proving that sometimes the most lasting victories come not from defeating your enemies, but from building something so beautiful that their hatred becomes irrelevant. And in the growing darkness of a Chicago summer evening, Eleanor Washington knew that her mother's legacy, and her own, would live on in every worker who now owned their own destiny, every apprentice who would learn that dignity and craftsmanship went hand in hand, and every family whose future had been secured by the radical act of believing that all people deserve respect. The Hamilton Empire had fallen, but something far better had risen in its place. And that, Eleanor thought as she watched the children play in the gathering twilight, was the kind of love story that mattered most: love for justice, love for human potential, and love that transforms even the deepest wounds into sources of healing for others. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating our enemies, but from building something so beautiful that their hatred becomes powerless. Eleanor chose love over revenge, and in doing so, created a legacy that will outlast any empire built on prejudice. What would you have done in her situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below, hit that like button if this story moved you, and subscribe for more incredible stories of triumph, transformation, and the power of choosing grace over grudges. Because sometimes, the most revolutionary act is simply treating all people with the dignity they deserve. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.